So today we're going to talk about GraphQL and Ruby. This is me. Those are characteristics about me. I do periodically blog on a site called pennyforyourcode.com if you want to find more information about stuff I say there. Sometimes this happens. This is the place I work, and we engage in financial transactions occasionally. So I'm CTO of this company. We do logistics work. So we're going to talk about GraphQL today. But it's not really fair to talk about GraphQL and explain why it exists unless you talk about sort of its main competitor, which is REST. That's a baby resting right there. That's what it feels like to me. And to kind of explain where it came from, like why was it needed. So if you just aren't familiar with REST, show of hands, who's kind of slightly unfamiliar with that term? Okay, so most people are somewhat familiar with REST. So REST actually does have an acronym. It does mean something. And if you just think of it in a Rails context, like Rails is very opinionated about trying to force you into that REST pattern, right? So if you've commonly done like a resources type declaration in your routes, you'll see that the routes it generates are trying to follow its best approximation of a REST pattern. Losing someone? Okay, cool. So here are some of the problems with the way REST works when we're specifically trying to do APIs, right? And I don't mean just APIs in a normal sense, but this really became a larger problem when we had to do APIs for things like single page applications and mobile applications, where our APIs were requesting a lot more data about more things. So this is sort of I don't want to go into slides for each one of these, but these are some of the problems that I've had personally with REST in the past, right? So underfetching, and I'm trying to illustrate them without giving a lot of explanation of just, here's the developer FML of what happens when these problems happen. So underfetching, you just notice that you made a bajillion API calls loading a page, and you don't know why. Like you're just doing a lot of traffic to get all the data you need, and so your individual API endpoints aren't giving you the data you need. Overfetching, you're trying to get a bunch of data onto a page, and you don't realize that you're loading a lot of data because that API endpoint may have been designed for some other use case, and you're having to reuse it. I did write these, by the way. They're not copied from somewhere. They're not true, but they're definitely things I thought of. Or documentation. A lot of times, there's not really a standard way to say you document your REST API. Everyone kind of invents their own thing using Swagger, Slate, a Word doc, whatever have you. And we have to reinvent the wheel every time we have a REST API of what's the cleanest way to document it. You also have no typing on your interfaces. So I know Ruby's a dynamically typed language, but at the same time, at the point at which you're interfacing to an external system or they're sending data in, you can rig this yourself, but it'd be nice if our APIs kind of handled hey, I don't ever expect a null to be here, or I expect this to always be a string, versus discovering it where it caused an unintended consequence way into the bowels of your app, and then you have to spend a day engineering, oh, it was because they sent a weird input to me. So those are some of the problems. So again, just to kind of illustrate, we're going to do kind of the other side of this. So if I was trying to build a page, I might have an API on a user profile page to get the user information, and then based on that, I can ask for the information about the user's post because now I have their ID, and then from that I can ask for their followers, right? So in a REST pattern based on the entity, you might have to make multiple requests to populate a page. It's not a great user experience. There's a lot of HTTP handshakes potentially. It's a lot of traffic, and it's confusing. And more than likely, even the responses you're getting from these, you have to kind of lock them in, right? Every time you hit it, you get the same data back, and maybe you don't need all these attributes in that particular request. Who's actually had this problem? Who's felt this problem in real life when they made an API? Okay, it's not just me. Good. All right. So this is what would happen in a GraphQL API. What essentially happens, and we'll go into the mechanics of this later because we're going to do some mob programming. But the front end makes a request to one endpoint, usually a post request, says it's going to be a query, so I want data, and there's already typing ahead of time that locks in what these values can be, but saying, I want users, here's a param of the user I want it, and I want back these things. You could have, posts could have multiple attributes you get back, or so could followers, but I only really care about this exact thing. So the one GraphQL endpoint can basically return data as requested by the client. And then the GraphQL API resolves it and returns exactly what's asked for, which means this, you could have a mobile app, a desktop app, different pages, request within sort of the bounded confines of the schema exactly what they want, and then you only get back what you need. So for the most part, Facebook, by the way, who invented GraphQL and open sourced it, has said they've never needed a versioned API because of GraphQL. Like you can just sort of have and manipulate your types in a way that causes, or just add attributes or et cetera, or name them other things. So they're like, that's why they're proud that like a flip phone from like 10 years ago or 15 years ago can still hit the same GraphQL endpoint. And the entire traffic of all Facebooks, it's one URL. So that's pretty cool. Does this, by the way, we haven't gone into like a lot of the details of what even this is. Does this kind of make sense conceptually? Like, it's almost like the front end's giving you a query, right? Within bounds, within a certain type. Like the attributes they're getting back, you have to declare in the schema, and we'll show you in a second, like has to be a string. This can or can't be null, etc. All right, so it solves some of these problems, right? Like underfetching, overfetching goes away. The client defines what they want to send back. Boom, we're done. Documentation. Because those types are there, which we haven't shown yet, there's actually really nice tools that let you like have essentially a visual interface, and the API is auto-documenting. Like the fact that GraphQL API exists means the server has to have sort of this interface schema of what can and can't be done, and that can simply be retrieved via a query and shown in these nice graphical tools. We'll look at those in a second. And no input output types done. Like you have types, like string, you get the basic strings, integers, decimals. They don't have decimals, they're called numbers. Things like that. So it's magic. Believe me, I'm a sales consultant. Everything is perfectly done. Just use GraphQL. You will never have problems again. But we're actually going to look at this in a more tangible way. So if you were to try to start in terms of how to implement GraphQL, there is a gem. There's a gem for everything. And there is a fairly centralized gem. It does seem like this is sort of the main one everyone refers to. It's called just GraphQL. And it's maintained by a guy who actually works at GitHub, who pretty much wrote the GitHub GraphQL API. The same gem is used by Shopify and other big Ruby shops. And they maintain it. There's even a paid version that has support if you need it. So it's got all of the things that you may need to kind of make sure it's battle tested, it's there, it's centralized. There's not a lot of fragmentation in terms of the libraries. So we're going to go to code. All right, this is the fun part. It's the most of the presentation. So I know you're not supposed to live code, which is why I'm going to do it. We're going to code this kind of like mob programming. So I have a quick little app that I wrote. The lemur will make sense in a second. If you want to follow along, you can go there. We're going to start from that. It's a plain Rails model that just has, plain Rails application that just has two models. And we're going to say, what if we need to expose it as a GraphQL API? Because you could naturally think of, oh, I can expose these as an REST API. So if you're interested, I'll give you a second to kind of pull up your laptops. And while, for those of you that are doing that, why can't I get out of this? All right. So this is what you'll get to when you get there, and I'll talk through this while people are pulling out the laptops. So we're gonna do what we call the lemur organizer, because for all the times you have too many lemurs and you don't know how, like where their names are, what their ages are. So we'll have a lemur organizer, and the starting point essentially is a Rails new plain Rails application, and it just has two models, which I just sort of created generators for. It doesn't really do much else. It has an owner. Owner has a first name, last name. Owner has many lemurs. Lemurs have an age, a name, and they belong back to the owner. That's it, right? So we will go from the starting point, and this is what we're going to try to do today. We're simply just going to add GraphQL to the project. It doesn't have it right now. We're going to run its generator, kind of generate some of its boilerplate to plug itself into Rails. We are going to add an owner's query. So in GraphQL, there's queries and mutations. Query is just when you get data, everything else is a mutation because you're changing something. It's pretty simple. So they simplified the REST pattern essentially. And then we're just going to, we're going to see if we can get the owners. We can see if we can define it so that you could optionally get the lemurs for owners. So you could have like a list of owners and all their lemurs, right? Think of like users and friends. And then we'll have a mutation to create a lemur. So you can add a lemur for an owner. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, pretty straightforward. All right, let's see how this goes. So, all right, so if I started fresh, who still needs a second who wants to follow along to like get their laptop out? All right, cool. So first thing we gotta do is add the gem. So I already have the gem, so it's already there. But yeah, it's added the gem to my project. We'll run their Rails generator. Do I need to pull this up so you guys can see? See. Never put it to the side before. All right. God damn, it's still at the bottom. Can everyone see it? Yeah, you know what? We'll just open Hyper.
Here's a presenter.
Yes, but it'll still put it at the bottom, the terminal. So this way, I guess I can resize this. This is the one thing I didn't think of today. Oh no. Okay.
Yeah.
That better? Or a little bigger?
Yeah.
There we go. I have no frame of reference as to whether he's joking or being serious. So I'm trusting all of you.
I can make glasses joke.
All right, now we have more space here. Great. All right, so Rails G GraphQL install. All right, we're going to look at these files, but just kind of getting a sense of like what the generator is doing. They added a directory called app GraphQL that didn't exist and added sort of like these base classes, and they don't really do much but give you places to put shared information. I don't want to go into this talk of all the minutiae of like what is an object, what's an enum, what's an input object. They're not that complicated if you read through the docs. We're just going to get sort of a functional hands-on introduction to build something simple. But these are all advanced things you can do should you ever need them. So we will they add to the routes some endpoints there, and that's what we're going to start looking at first. And we're going to kind of follow that to kind of make sure we understand what they did. Can you guys see this, or do I make this bigger?
Can you make it bigger?
Yeah. Shit. Again, another thing I've never had to do. Technology has failed me. That didn't make it bigger at all.
Did you present a road? You should make that.
Yeah, that's true. Whoa, that's great. That's super cool. I didn't even know I could do that. Wonders of an IDE. Yes. Whoa, it full screens that too. That's so cool. All right. This is so sweet. All right. Thanks, James. So we didn't have any routes before. And this is what they put in its place. So this is GraphQL is sort of a tool that is used out there, and it's sort of like if you've ever used Postman to simulate API calls, it's like a tool like that that gives you a visual interface. So they're only mounting it in development, and that's what we're going to use to kind of like ping our GraphQL API and see if it's working. And then they added this one endpoint, and you really, if you had a pure GraphQL server, you don't need anything else in your routes but this. Like this is the only thing you'll ever need. Everything is a POST request to the same endpoint, and the GraphQL controller handles it from there. So they added that controller for us. Well, it's not syntax, that's weird. No, whatever, okay. So they added this file for us, and I will simply, like this is sort of their boilerplate to like manage some stuff in Ruby. You can customize this of how you want to handle errors that come back. But here's what they're doing. So whenever you get the query in, you have essentially variables, which could be like user ID 1. The query itself, which is that string I showed you of the thing that the client's requesting, and then the operation name. So it could be give me the lemurs, could be create lemur, whatever it is. And then the context is something you can pass into the schema, which is this that does all the work. And this is probably the place to terminate your authentication. So GraphQL doesn't do authentication. You want to like use devise or whatever, figure out your current user, and you can pass that into the context so you can handle the rest of the things if you wanted to, let's say, restrict actions by user inside the schema. And then even in my project, outside of actually adding a line or two here, no real reason to change this file for the most part, no matter how big your application gets. So the schema is, all right, so inside of app GraphQL, we should drag this over. GraphQL, your schema, and most applications will have one schema unless you really had a reason to have a separate endpoint. The schema doesn't do much except have these two things. Because remember, everything in GraphQL is a query or a mutation. So you're either asking for data or you are asking for a change to the data. And then inside of those, you will define how many ever queries or mutations we have. Am I jumping in, like not explaining some terms? I just want to make sure everyone's with me, because I know I haven't gone through the theoretical, like what's a query, what's a mutation, what's an input object. Making sense so far?
Yeah.
All right, no one confused? All right. So if I jump to the query type, again, this is a file that they gave us. And they gave us these other sort of base classes, sort of like Rails-like, where they give you like the base model, essentially.
Just to ask, so query is your read, and mutation is everything else is your cut.
Yes.
Okay.
And your mutations aren't like, don't have to follow a pattern. Like the mutations, the queries are supposed to be kind of like lemurs, lemur. Like they're just supposed to be the thing that you're generally asking for. If you want to follow that pattern, most people do. And then the mutations are always like create lemur. Like they're not like restricted to the pattern that you have in REST. Like you could have disable lemur as a pattern. Like you could just, but generally you start with a verb or the thing you're doing and then the thing you're doing it to. It's just sort of the convention I've seen if you look at like the various GraphQL APIs. So you can describe as much stuff as you want. Like before there's always kind of a question, like if you weren't like creating, editing, or deleting a thing, like people would kind of break the REST pattern to have like another thing. That's totally okay. You just describe what the mutation does. So this is some boilerplate they gave us. And this is where it kind of gets to where we're going to start writing some stuff and we're just going to go on the fly. Like we'll have to pull up the documentation, whatever. I've done it, but I don't have it exactly memorized, every bit of syntax. So the first thing, if you look at the requirements, is we want to be able to, or number 3, we want to add an owners query. So if we have owners, we want to be able to get a list of them. Essentially think of this like your index query. So owners. And this second value is the type of the thing that you're returning. You're declaring that. So it could be a string, but in our case, we're not returning a plain string. We're returning like an object that could have an ID, a first name and a last name. So we will have to replace this in a second, but I'm going to jump to that. I'm going to just indent these so we can kind of, all right. All right, may have been a bad idea because I have no screen space. Forget these things, they're just sort of the editor adding them in. All right, you have to always have this. You have to have null, true, or false. So you have to always tell the front end for something you're returning, could it be null or not? So if I say null, false, this can, when we replace this, this could be an empty array, but it can't be null, right? So the client can always rely upon that. You can add a description, and this is the resolver. So if this is named owners, we have to have, in the implementation of GraphQL Ruby, this has to be called owners, and this is where we would call like a service object or do whatever we have to. In our case, we're able to do something like, for right now, owner.all, like it's returning the relation, because this will make more sense when we do this part. We need to replace this with an array of something that is an object that is an owner. So we actually have to create that, that type. And they generally want you to subclass base object for that to have like another thing that you could return. We'll do that for. So we'll do like owner type. I don't call it owner in Rails because in Rails it gets very confused if it's the active record model or if it's the type, unless you prefix it some other way. And I forget the exact syntax, so we're just going to go here. They have pretty good docs in GraphQL Ruby. We really need sort of an object. They have pretty good explanations. And at the end of the day, we really just need something like this. So I think I have to do like that. And let's say we can return its ID, which there is a native ID type inside of GraphQL, which cannot be null. Well, and it did have a first name, which I think I also validate has to be there, which is a string. This is also going to be a string because it's going to be last name. And I believe these are all validated to actually be there on that object. So now, because I have a type that's like the thing that an owner is, I can go back to my query type. And this square brackets tells it it's an array. And I do types owner type. So far, does this kind of now make sense? So like, these are defining all my queries. You can find some ways to break these out in other files. We're leaving it in one file. You will have a query that you can say you can request owners. It will return an array of owners of that specific type. it has to be present. So it's gonna, even if it's an empty array, it's going to be not null. And the way to resolve it is getting owner.ul, which effectively returns an enumerable, like a thing like an array, an active record relation, that this can each over to make sure it confies to the owner type. Does that, yeah?
Where does the constant owner come from?
Owner was one of the models we have.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this was one of the things we started with. We literally just started with this.
Right.
It just has first name, last name, and it can get many lemurs. That's all we have. So let's get to the part that probably is the most, oh, we need to start the server. All right. So what we're actually going to do is go to that utility that they added in our routes. If you look at routes, remember saying in development they add this graphical, like a web utility that's sort of an engine that lets you simulate requests. So this is at localhost 3000 GraphQL. This is sort of a really commonly used sort of a utility tool for development. And you can actually get it as like a Electron app. It's like a standalone. You can run it in the web. They conveniently make it so you can mount it in your Rails app. So I think this is from when I was testing it. But yeah, if I wrote, well, let's start with the clean slate. So if I came here fresh, it would look pretty much like nothing, right? So I didn't do anything else, right? Open docs. Because GraphQL is typed, if I look here, I can easily see what my docs are. So you're always going to have at the top level query and mutation. This query type now says I can request owners. This is saying I'm going to get back an array of owners. The exclamation mark means it's never going to be null. So if I click on that, it says basically same thing. It's an array of owners. If I had a description, it would appear here,
So
and it tells me.
It will never have any null inside it or be null itself.
That's there's two layers to this. So if you look at,
Because there's exclamation point outside.
yeah, if there was one. Yeah, so because there's one inside and outside that says no value will be null, and the whole thing on the outside will also not be null.
Yeah.
So you will get, so you could have empty array is okay, but you couldn't have like something and then null, yeah. There's like actually a really long article inside the Ruby like docs, the GraphQL Ruby docs explaining all of that, like how to indicate various null capabilities. And then yeah, like these are the things you can ask for. I could ask for an ID, first name, last name. It tells me what types I'm expecting back. ID inside of GraphQL land actually is not an integer, because in Rails normally IDs are numbers. They can be strings because they have to also work with MongoDB where IDs have alphanumeric characters. So if I was going to use this, I would do query, and I can just put a name, whatever I want, but we'll put owners. And it has some nice autocomplete added to it. And again, all these docs, this whole thing, I didn't do anything, right? You saw what I did. Did practically nothing. And it's saying ID, first name, last name. And the Ruby library also takes care of, like, JavaScript usually doesn't do snake case, it does camel case. So it converts all that for you. This should return, oh, I did have it, yeah. I was working on this earlier today, so I did make an owner, and therefore there is the owner Ricky Bobby. And so if we added, I guess we should do it from here. Added a Rails console, and then we did owner.create first name Bobby Ricky. Heresy. Okay. I didn't need to do that, but yeah. Run the query again. Got two of them. And remember, this is like a standard, right? So if you are working on the front end or an app, there's GraphQL client libraries for everything. And now automatically everything's just working together. Everything's checking types. Like if the front end realizes that you are trying to make a query that violates the type definition it already got from the back end, the front end won't even run the query. Like it already knows it's not going to work. So it's nice. It gives you really, really convenient tooling. And there's other tools like this. There's Altair. There's a few others. People are experimenting with sort of the Postman equivalent, if you would have to say, for GraphQL tooling. All right, so let's go to our second requirement. Everyone with me so far? Kind of what we did? All right.
I have a couple questions,
Yeah.
actually. One is, well, I don't know if this general allows it, but like, does it also allow you to export like on that right side, it was pretty nice being able to sort of explore almost like the docs.
The docs?
Yeah, like
So the docs themselves, okay, are actually a thing. Like there is a thing inside of GraphQL called an introspection query. So like it's a query.
it's like a head query almost.
Yeah, it's actually kind of similar-ish to like what they called WSDLs in SOAP APIs, where you like ask like, give me the definition of what you can do.
Yeah.
Like to the extent that that was a good idea, which there's some benefits to that notion of like, make sure that I'm not doing something that's incompatible with you. That's the idea. And like you actually can decide whether you want to allow the introspection query to go through in production or not, which by default it does. Hopefully you've put authentication authorization to make sure people can't use it, but you can decide how much you want to expose. So all of these tools, whatever you use, are simply running that query and then just displaying the results.
So
that's all they're doing.
That's what that tool's doing, right? So
Yeah.
if you went just to another API, if they allowed it, like you said.
Absolutely, yeah, actually. So like if you go to like GitHub, right, like you could, if you got the standalone version of this right above here, there's a URL of like where you want to hit to get your query, and you can like add headers and stuff like that. I'll show it to you actually.
Is GraphQL like the most popular?
It is, yeah. You can see this is the same exact tool. This is our production application right now, which is aired. Oh no, it's not aired, it's just it's not running. But yeah, you can see I've got tabs, the URL hitting. I can manipulate the headers because this we use for authentication, stuff like that. Just to kind of follow up on the question, another one that I saw recently, there's another one I just heard came out that's built in, but Altair. I tried this one and I actually kind of liked it a lot. Developers like building tools. A lot of people get motivated. So there's a plethora of them. GraphQL is by far the most battle tested and oldest of them so far. So you have, and like the editor, if you are a user of like any of the main editors, a lot of them are now building plugins for that. So for example, RubyMine, which you saw earlier, has a plugin now where you can configure in a config file what the GraphQL API is. It will run the introspection query and inline in your JavaScript if it sees GQL, which is the annotation of how it knows you're in GraphQL land. It will inspect as you're typing inside your code editor that you're writing stuff that's compliant before it's even run against the server. So it's basically giving you IntelliSense type stuff in your editor. So people are going wild with all the tooling because as soon as we add types, you get tools. So good question. What was the second thing we need to do? All right, so now lemurs, right? So remember, if you go up, owners are there. They have many lemurs, right? So our lemur model has an owner ID attached to it where you can like look up. So you may naturally say, hey, now I'm looking at a page where I'm looking at other users and want some information about my friend's lemurs, let's say, right? So here's how we add that. This is where it kind of gets useful. So we'll know we'll need a lemur type. So I'm just going to copy this one. Maybe some of these things don't work in this editor. All right. Lemur type. Which had an ID, and I believe it had an age that was an integer. I think this one always gets me. I think I have to do like that. And I believe it can be null. And it has a name. A string, and it cannot be null. Yeah, okay. I believe there might already be one in the database from what I was doing earlier. So when we go back to our owner type, we can do field lemurs, which is an array of types lemur type, which will also do a null false, because at worst it'll be an empty array. So that being done, go back to this actually. Just refresh it so it gets the docs again. Lemurs, ID, age, name. See if that ran. Whoa, it ran. Okay, great. Such a pleasant surprise when things work. Yeah, so you can see that you've got an owner, and now I'm seeing the lemurs for this owner, which before I already was playing with this and added 3. And if you look down here, the one we had just added together has none. And it knows this. The way it kind of handled all this automatically for us was when we were on the owner type, the way that the library works is when you try to like say like return the JSON for a particular owner with an owner type, right? Whatever these fields are, it first looks at that object and calls like sends that message. So it'll try to call owner.lemurs. If it doesn't get that, it'll try to see if it's a hash and call like owner like symbol lemurs. And then if it doesn't have that, it'll try to call it again. And you can like, if you wanted to have some custom resolution of a thing, like, I don't know, are they happy? And you made that like a bool, whatever. You could just have def happy in here and just resolve it your own. So you would have access to like, you could call host object or something like that. You get access to the owner it's working on, and you can inspect some private method to determine whether it's happy or not, and that would become an attribute. That's how it got this, because we have an association on our, because owner has many lemurs, you can call owner an instance of owner.lemurs and get it, and therefore it's running the query. And then when it has the lemur, it's looking at the lemur type and saying, okay, let me ask it for its ID, let me ask it for its age, and those are just active record columns, right? There's database columns, they can get that. If you're really, really clever, you'll know what problem already happens with this. Okay, yeah, n+1 queries, yeah. So the library by default does nothing to protect you from that. But you know what? Neither does Rails, because that's really, really easy to do in Rails. However, there are not really complicated tactics to go ahead and deal with that, similar to Rails. We'll talk about GraphQL batch is a solution by Shopify that solves this problem. And it's worked pretty well for us in production.
Can you describe the problem really quickly?
Oh, n+1 queries are when, so an example being here, right? So because it's going through this sequence one by one, if we had 100 owners here and each of them had 100 lemurs, what would happen is it would come to this owner and be like, hey, you have lemurs. And then the database would say, oh, I need to get the lemurs. So it would run a query for the lemurs for this owner. And then it would go down to like the next one and do it again. So it's n+1 because how many ever owners you have, you'd have to do that many queries. So if you were, instead of kind of bunching up and getting data from your database at once, you might have one API call result in a lot of queries, and therefore it runs really slow. Whereas hopefully you can find a way to be smart enough to know, no, I need all this data so I can just get it one time and not do a back and forth for each call. Is that a good explanation of n+1? Fair enough? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just curious why wouldn't the library already be smart enough to detect that?
So it's not the library, because the library is not paired to active record, right? The library is just saying like, oh, you have a thing where you want to match it to the owner type, and you've given me a thing that you're calling an owner. And you've said to ask it for its lemur. So it's just sending, give me your lemurs. Like that could be a hard-coded array. It doesn't know. And the fact that at the end of the day, active record, the fact that it is a database column, like GraphQL doesn't know that. So it's having to like ask active record, which is going to do a query. So it's actually a thing in active record that by default it's not smart enough. And Rails has a thing called includes that some of you may have used, where it tries to, ahead of time, whenever you try to resolve the query, figure out, oh, I'm going to need these things, and so do one query to get all of them. And you essentially have to kind of, the problem though is like in a traditional Rails endpoint with a traditional REST API, if you hit an endpoint and always return the same data, you always know what models to include, like what models to eager fetch. But with GraphQL, like a lemur could have been gotten to because we have some other model that has it associated, so it doesn't know how you're going to resolve it. So that's why it's a little more complicated. Yeah.
I don't have a site like right handy. I actually think it's a deeper problem that it may not be possible to not include the n+1 problem as a language or framework. Like it's kind of like the halting problem. Like how do you prove that there's no way to have to crash without even active record doesn't know which database you're going to work on top of or exactly what you're going to want to do. So there's always.
But this is why like people build REST, they'll create an endpoint and they'll like know, okay, for this specific request, I'm just going to hard code these things.
Sure.
But if you want to have the flexibility, it's very difficult. I don't know.
Well, shoot, even in Rails or not really even Rails, but ORM-based data modeling, you'll end up in a situation where the native way of getting the data that you need can be taxing even just for the database server to return. And then you're looking at creating SQL views. I mean,
it's like eventually, just create an SQL API, just pass in the query, and you have.
Let's just skip GraphQL. Let's just give the client SQL access.
Yeah.
I generally go with just return the whole database on every call until that, you can't go wrong with that. It works in my machine in development. So we're going to jump to mutations real quick, and then we'll conclude. So mutations are, again, the other kind of hard-coded, like special type inside of GraphQL, and this is everything that you want to change, right? So a query, just like a get call, should never mutate data. Like it should always just be a fetch. So we're just jumping to their mutation type, and the way this is their their boilerplate they give us. So we are going to. I don't like the way they exactly did it here. Well, we'll leave it in there. Normally, you would want to put this into a separate file. Like each query and each mutation, you don't want to like leave them all in this one massive long file. So we'll do it for now. So we'll have create lemur. So a mutation, again, can still have like a thing that it can take and return, right? So for us, we do need like an owner ID. I really don't like this syntax. I'm going to call an audible real quick. We're going to do it the proper way. So if you go to their docs, to the mutations, mutation classes, they kind of explain this to you in a very nice way. And we really just need something that looks like this is for our mutation. And we want to put it into its own file. Which is really funny because they put this like, base mutation class, but they still actually do have the proper separate directory for mutations and just don't put anything in it. And we'll include it into the other file in a second, but we're going to write it real quick. I don't believe we have a base mutation class. We really just need to extend not the relay one. I think it's just, oh, hold on. Yeah. I think it's just that. Somewhere else in the docs, but I want to go dig for it. We don't need that. We will need to know which owner to associate our lemur with. So we'll take an ID of the owner ID. And fields, again, when you run the mutation, you can still let the client decide what it wants back after you've run the mutation. So we will return the lemur. So it's generally common practice when you do a mutation, both of you have all your fields be nullable, because the errors you want to return as data. So you could have rather than just having the whole thing blow up, you could have it fail, and then you would return lemur null errors, like your, let's say, Rails validation errors, something like that, whatever you want to. So you always have a resolve method, and it can take your inputs. So we will get owner ID. And I think the way they made this work, we can kind of just keep replacing these model names. It's like that. Owner.lemurs. We will need more arguments because we'll need to know the lemur's name. We do need to know that. And age. By the way, we're doing this as a shorthand way. Just if you go do this yourself, it's actually not generally good practice to have every single param put right on the mutation. You usually create another type called an input object. Nothing's really special about it. It's just an actual type. And you say, make my inputs conform to this type. So you can separate out, if you've got 5 or 10 inputs, and you may even want some logic of shared logic between creating types of users, you separate that out from just having it directly in the mutation.
So you have one parameter instead of n.
Yeah, you'd have an inputs parameter and be it has to be the type of the create lemur input types.
Okay.
Yeah. So you are supposed to generally couple the mutation to the input object type.
this kind of becomes a whole DSL you're describing here.
Yeah, and that's really the only way that they can implement. It's specific to the GraphQL Ruby library.
Yeah.
The docs are pretty expansive. There's a lot of them, so they're generally pretty well done. There's been a few complaints recently because this whole class-based structure was something he changed last year, and before it used to be a bit different. And there was a bunch of people complaining because like he took like a month-ish or two-ish after that to update the docs, which.
New paradigm.
Yeah, I mean, so for a while, here's the thing, he left up the old docs, and you could still use the old version. Yeah. I think he was like, well, people complained it wasn't Ruby-ish enough because it wasn't class-based, and then he like made it that way, and people still complained at him. So.
One big lambda function. The
Sorry?
resolve was one big lambda function,
Yeah.
and it was just
Yeah. Yeah. So like I haven't seen, at least since we've been using it since that change, any like really major changes that would make me go like, oh, like it's not like if you're in the React world, like React router v3 to v4, he just threw the whole thing out, right? Like something like that. This is the only time I've seen them do something like that. All right. Should have just done find and replace. This is like really, really similar if it works. Does this look right? All right. I believe it's mutation after the syntax. Yeah, it's like that. This must be the most boring talk ever. Just watch a dude type.
So can I do,
Yeah. Oop.
like, is it only updates, or can I do some kind of can I have a callback method that a post would actually call and do a bunch of stuff? Like a control action I can do.
Can you explain? I'm not understanding following.
One command might do 5 birthdays,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I update a lemur's name, and now the name, so I gotta go tell the zoo a different name, and it's gonna have to make a notice that's gonna go emailed out to everybody.
Oh, yeah, inside this resolve function, like we're putting it all in line, like here, but like the actual logic is whatever you want. Like it's simply a way to get inputs and then tell you they want to do a thing. So like common practice would be to put a service object here that actually does the logic.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, he actually like in the docs is like use it to get the stuff, but like then just go into like plain Ruby land and do your thing.
But this is my entry into the whole domain. That's right.
Yeah, this is like very similar to a controller, right? Where you want to have like thin controllers, like move that stuff to whatever your preference, model, service objects, whatever.
Awesome.
And then like this is, the only thing is like this interface, we're returning this hash here, has to have conform to the fields that could be asked for. So right, like lemur and errors.
That are available to resolve because of that field stuff.
Say that again? Like could you get down here, have these like be wrong, and therefore the response fails because it's conformed to the types? Is that the question?
Yeah. Oh, I see. Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah.
Like if I misspelled lemur here, and therefore there was no, like the object didn't have lemur, like yeah, it would fail because at the end it would be like, hey, the thing you gave me I can't figure out what lemur is.
How does it fail?
Different ways. like something like that would blow up because there's no way like it can figure out what to do. But then there's other, like GraphQL, but within it has a thing called like top level errors, which is sort of like errors outside the data structure at all. This is where we're creating a thing called errors. But like you can have like, I just couldn't run or I was down, and you can return that. And you can choose within your application how to use top level errors. But from what I've seen, it's more top level errors are used for, yeah, top level errors are used mostly for queries not resolving, or they're generally used when something that you couldn't explain it on this specific mutation. Because the nice thing about the top level errors are just going to be strings. This lets you type the response of the errors. Like you can have a complex object. Like we use error codes in our application with like a specific hash. So the front end can be like, oh, would this error code show this particular pretty text to the customer? So that's kind of up to you of how you want to communicate. But this is the pipe that gets data in and out. You choose what you want to send.
Can you also do, like for authorization, for example, if you want to
Yes.
authorize for, like, can can you just do authorize there? Like, will it work?
You can, actually, and that's built into the library. There's so many ways to do authorization.
So it's no, it's not that much different than the old way. I mean, this is like mutations are controllers, basically, right?
I kind of felt like for the most part, there was like the business logic of like the complications of creating a lemur, like I need to send a notification, whatever, that I wanted to focus on, and like this just enabled me to get there quicker. Like the drudgery of like writing API docs, like worrying that like, okay, well no, you have to send me an owner ID, and then someone doesn't, and I need to like something fail somewhere else because nil was being passed through the application.
So it helps you with that. It helps
Yeah, it helps me not deal with the bullshit as much, and more with like the actual things I want to deal with. So like I just spend less time on them. Like I'm not worried about versioning an API. Like if I really had a non-compatible thing, I'd maybe make like another named mutation or something like that. So it's just made things less painful. Is the real life experience I've had with, and if anyone else has anything else to share about like the actual impact, yeah.
Are there analytic libraries for
Yes.
GraphQL?
You guys are asking a lot of questions that are on the slides right after we jump out of the code. So yeah, that's a really good question, and we'll deal with it at the end. So just to kind of get to the authorization, like there's so many ways you can do it. You can have ways within the tooling of GraphQL Ruby to like limit what people can see, what they can do. There you can just call def authorize, like within the mutation, it'll run that every time. So I have that, like I have a class called like an authenticated mutation, which always tries to verify the customer is authenticated and does all that before the resolve actually runs. They have prescriptions for pundit integration, and that actually, they have a couple of things like that where they're available in the pro version, where if you pay them $1,000 a year, they give you like these pre-built, really nice integrations into authorization libraries, and like subscriptions and all of that. There's a whole bunch of stuff I'm not talking about just for simplicity, but if you go through here, everything is explained. Like subscriptions are basically getting data over WebSockets when other things change, letting your server publish. This is all the stuff you get with Pro. So if you're interested after this presentation, like just dig through these docs. They're great. It's very powerful. More powerful than you want. Like, we're going to talk about this later. You can make sure your front end's not requesting a thing that's so complicated your back end could never run it. So, all right. I have no idea whether our mutation runs. Let's check that, and then we'll jump to the questions again. So because I added that create lemur, and you guys saw me typing for a second, when I jumped into like from here and I clicked on mutations now, automatically documented. In fact, if I want to explain what that even is, I believe I just do description. I think I got this right. There it is, creates your lemur. So on every attribute, on every mutation, you can add in docs. There's even, you can do additional validation on top of these even. If I go to create lemur, it's like telling me, all right, what I expect. They automatically created the create lemur payload, which is like the thing you could ask for back. And then here's the things that I need, telling you whether they're required or not, what they are. You can add descriptions to those. Let's see if our lemur creation runs. So mutation, and this top level name is just me giving it a name. It doesn't actually have to match. Owner ID, 1, age, 1, name, fuzzy. And we could do lemur errors. So it's already, see how it's telling me already? It's like the red squiggly. Hey, this is not a thing that's just on its own. This is a type. Because lemur is a type where I have to ask things on the type. So I can ask for its age and name back. And so this is like a query mutation in one, right? Because I'm saying do this thing, and then I also get to define what I get back. So how many times have you done a thing in an API and we're like, oh shit, now I got to refetch the data again to then update the stuff in the UI. Don't crash. Holy shit. Amazing. All right. Did we see if the ID is really real? Yeah, 5. Okay, that's further than we were. And then if we go back to the history, rerun that. Fuzzy, there's fuzzy, one we just created. So you can see, like, very little effort compared to all the shit I'd have to do if it was a traditional API. So that's all the code, I think. Yeah, that's all I wanted to show you. So we'll jump back to the presentation. Okay, You guys are great. You guys already like asked me half these questions. So things it doesn't really solve, right? So n+1 queries. There's a gem where you can layer onto GraphQL, something called GraphQL batch. And what it really does is it lets you essentially, it's not very hard to integrate, but what's really doing is like accumulating as your GraphQL response is being accumulated, and then when it's actually trying to cast it to JSON, at that point, the batch library has accumulated all the IDs it needs to resolve, so it makes one query for that type instead of making multiple queries. So it's actually the exact same mechanism of what includes does in Rails. It's just sort of rigged onto this. It's essentially a lazy evaluation of the stuff you need. So excessive data requests from clients. So we've given a lot of power to the client, right? Like let's say, hey, you can get all these owners, you can get all these lemurs, whatever. What if you forgot to add a default limit onto it, right? In fact, in the docs, he kind of explains, always put a default limit. Like add a limit onto every index query and put a default on there. But let's just say you allow them to do things that are really complicated. You can actually, inside Ruby GraphQL, there's a complexity API where you can declare on each query how complex this is and limit the total query mutation. So it analyzes the query before it runs and says, whoa, whoa, you're asking for something that I think is going to be too hard. And so you protect yourself from blowing the server up. With great power comes great responsibility, I guess. You can also limit the depth, so making sure you're not going too many layers deep and having too many queries on associated models that are really far away from the main model. Perf trackers can track, so I think someone asked for analytics. So from what I've seen from the Ruby ones, GraphQL Ruby has, I'll just switch to the ones that they support. I think it's instrumentation or, yeah. There we go. So these are the ones they like already have instrumentation kind of knowledge of how to hook into. So if you use AppSignal, they already kind of can tell AppSignal all the data about the queries, New Relic, Scout. I found this is the worst one though. And then for a reason why. Skylight works pretty well. Datadog, haven't tried them in this context. So here's the challenge. When you have most of these things are designed for regular web requests where everything comes at a different URL. So like they'll look at the rack middleware and be like, oh, it's this URL. Let me bundle these all together. GraphQL has everything go to one endpoint. And then the queries within that are different, right? Based on the parameters that are being sent to one endpoint on the server. So some of these integrations, like some of these tools, are smart enough to realize, oh, these are all different things. Let me make sure I group them, like all the queries for lemurs together and all the queries for owners together. Some of them aren't. So, you know, from the ones that I've tried, I usually does that. The ones that I've tried, Scout does not separate them, but Skylight and New Relic actually will show you like the different transaction types, queries, and mutations separately. And yeah, finally, it doesn't have built-in auth or authorization. That's sort of up to you. Almost everyone generally terminates the authentication layer before you get into the GraphQL at all. So like finding who the user is, and you can attach them to the context. And then if you want to do things based on who the user is, what roles they have within, you can do that inside. And authorization is up to you. There's a bunch of recommendations of options within the GraphQL Ruby library. The way we do it is like we just contextualize it in the process of the way we organize our service objects. But you can use Pundit or whatever you want. Authorization always seems, it's very custom to each application anyways. What's up?
I just want to say, just everyone memorize, authentication is not authorization.
Yes. So for those of you who may not know the difference, some of you probably do, but like authentication is identifying who the user is, so making sure that's actually the person sending the request, and it's not someone faking them or whatever. Authorization is limiting what they can do. So it's like, you know, Dave, I can figure out that's Dave, he came to my house. But I may not want him in my bedroom, so that's keeping him from my bedroom. So that's the authorization part. He's not authorized to go in there.
Y'all laugh, but like big money has been lost in businesses because programmers not doing that deep in the application, and there was an authorization bypass.
Yeah.
Because it assumed, oh, you can send the GraphQL query. Of course I can give you back the data that you just asked me for.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. And there's like read through the docs, there's a lot of ways that they allow you to restrict things, but just don't ignore it and be like, yeah, that's just, I don't want to look at it. Yeah. So these are things that are really kind of popular tool services within the GraphQL community. Just to be honest, like, GraphQL is generally it's very JavaScript oriented, very Node oriented. So a lot of the services and tooling kind of tailor to those languages and ecosystems. But these are ones that are really awesome. This is one almost everyone should use. But I'll start with Prisma. Is like, anyone heard of GraphQL before? It was a service where they kind of did a backend as a service using GraphQL. They now are making Prisma, which is only for JavaScript, TypeScript, and Go, but it's like an ORM on steroids. If you're really doing a Node project, look at them. Apollo is from the Meteor team, for Meteor.js, and they do client and server libraries to make GraphQL interactions easier. So if you're writing your client, I would highly recommend. It's very hard to find a reason not to use Apollo client. It's basically like your Axios or Request or whatever other fetch API you use in the client. AWS AppSync is I think it's about a year old, something like that. It's a backend as a service offering, very kind of, to me from reading the docs, I haven't tried it, felt very much like Firebase or Parse, but offered by Amazon, and the front end to it is all GraphQL. So you actually like use some JSON file to declare what your schema is, and then they just build a backend in a server for you, and then you just hit the API from the front end. So it's like meant to make so that Rubyists don't have jobs. And then Hasura is sort of an instant real-time GraphQL API on top of Postgres. I'm a little dubious of them. They have been around for a little bit. Good team, but that just seems weird to me. Like, your application's just kaput if they go out of business. And I think, again, their client libraries are very JavaScript focused. So that's it. All right. Any questions that I didn't answer yet?
There's a gem called Goldie Loader, which
Yes.
automatically handles M+1 queries.
It doesn't work under certain circumstances, which are outlined in their like README, and like that would solve the problem if the limitations fit your use case. You wouldn't have to do anything; it would just work. Because again, all of these are just active record relations until you actually try to fetch each record, and GraphQL Ruby respects that, so it would work. And it's actually mentioned in he has a section in the README somewhere, being like, hey, N+1's a problem. Here's how I think of it, where you can do it without any like gem at all, and it's kind of complicated to look at. Here's a couple gems that help you, and if Goldie Loader works for you, use that. Cool. All right, to be honest, I did not go over some of the technical minutia of like input objects, scalars, enums, all of that stuff. But I was trying to make like, does anyone feel like this, you had a sense of how you could use it to get started, and then you can add those things if you need? Okay, cool. That's all I have. Thank you.